Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the symposium Status of Biodiversity in the Amazon. We are going to start with James Albert. He's going to be our first presentation, the introduction. He's online. Can we include his presentation, please? It's a pleasure to have you all here. So we are going to have 5 presentations, and in the end, we're going to have a time for discussions and conclusions. You're welcome to make your questions by the end of each presentation, but also during the discussion time. Are we ready for James' presentation? Okay, thank you.
Welcome to the Symposium on Status of Biodiversity in the Amazon. I'm James Albert from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, and my co-authors for this talk this morning are Julia Arieira from the Science Panel for the Amazon and Catherine Sayer from the IUCN. As you know, the Amazon is an immense and an amazing place filled with biodiversity and other important ecosystem services. Currently, about 10% of all described plant and vertebrate species in the world, are known from the Amazon. And if you expand that zone to include the neotropics, we're talking about upwards of 1/3 of all terrestrial, continentally distributed organisms from the neotropical realm. It's an immense region, the Amazon, with over 7 million square kilometers, as you can see in this map showing the boundaries of the basin. And yet that large area represents less than 5% of the Earth's surface. So it's really an immense amount of biodiversity in a relatively small amount of total habitat volume. And when you consider the aquatic side, the concentrations are even greater. Although the Amazon is, of course, the biggest river in the world, discharging about 1/5 of all the world's fresh water to the sea in a given year, that still represents a tiny fraction of the world's total aquatic habitat, with most of it being, of course, in the oceans. This symposium was made possible because of a recent report by the Science Panel for the Amazon, their assessment report, which was a compilation and in a collaboration of over 230 scientists from 18 countries, including 12 countries, or over half from countries that have Amazonian territory. About half of the authors were women, and there were several representative authors on the papers from indigenous peoples and local communities in the Amazon basin. The facts that were reported are many, including the total amount of diversity in many of these species-rich groups of organisms. There are currently about 120,000 named plant and animal and fungal species in the Amazon. And that's probably something like 10% of the total that really exists. There are probably over 1.2 million species in the Amazon. So the total undescribed is about 90%. We are still in the early stages of describing and documenting Amazonian species diversity. Species richness is only one of several important biodiversity metrics. Biogeography and geographic distributions are another. At this moment, however, we have even less good understanding of the distributions of the species. Many species are known from only one or several localities, and often in poorly characterized or their old collections. Something like 14% of all of the known described species in the Amazon are assessed for IUCN criteria, and of course, the great majority have not been described at all. The IUCN Red List represents our best gold standard to date for assessing conservation risk of species in the world. All of our conservation efforts rely on understanding, getting estimates for the numbers of species, the independent lineages, their geographic ranges, are they restricted or widespread, and also aspects of their functional diversity and ecological traits like dispersal ability, mating systems, migrations, etc., that help us manage and conserve these species. The most recent IUCN Red List, version 2021.2, has risk assessments for over 130,000 species worldwide, mostly animals, plants, and fungi. And these, of course, represent the basic facts that we use in conservation and legal statutes, including the US Endangered Species Act, Convention on Biological Diversity, the CITES listing, and the IPBES listings, all of these rely critically on IUCN assessments from, as you can see down here, from least concern all the way through threatened categories to extinct. These assessments are also, of course, used widely in communicating directly with the public in a wide variety of venues, as you see here. Listing on the IUCN proceeds in two general phases. The first is acquisition of the basic data, the describing of the species, characterization of their population status, and geographic distributions, which takes decades of taxonomic work by experts who have to be trained through many, many years of training. And also the risk assessment process, which it takes further years to compile the data and assign species into these various conservation threat categories. All of this done by scientists with specialized training in taxonomy and conservation, such as Professor Caroline Chabot, you can see here, working in Peru on insects. We know that the IUCN Red List is heavily biased in terms of its taxonomic composition towards animals and plants that are easier and more accessible for assessing. Of those 130,000 species worldwide, 74% of them are vertebrates, and there are relatively fewer species than what we would call ecosystem engineers, invertebrates, plants, and fungi that form the structural basis of ecosystems, reefs and forests, and also, of course, drive the biogeochemical processes that form water and soil chemistry. The Red List includes mostly it's composed of terrestrial species, relatively few marine species, and very few of the species are freshwater fishes or other freshwater organisms. There are several criteria used in assessing species by the IUCN. Criterion A involves primarily an assessment of population size and the trend of the population and habitats that the populations live in. Criterion B refers to geographic range restriction. There are two major ways to measure that I'll describe in a moment: the extent of occurrence and the area of occupancy. And using these criteria and some other variables, IUCN specialists and taxonomists are able to assess the particular threatened categories. This symposium will be focusing primarily on using the geographic range data in the absence when we don't have data or sufficient data on population size or trends. Here's an example from a fish in the northern Amazon. This is an electric fish of the genus Acahuayo. You can see here two ways of assessing its extent of occurrence using different sub-basin levels in the Hydrosheds data set. Level 7 or level 8, you get different estimates for its area of occurrence. It's also possible to assess them using a grid map. In this case, the area of occurrence would use a 2x2 kilometer grid map. This is very strongly influenced by sampling. The poorer the sampling, the smaller the area of occurrence would be, the area of occupancy. But the presence or absence of these in this particular subbasins would be less affected. So usually the area of occurrence, the area of occupancy is an underestimate of their range, geographic range. So here are some of the numbers that are used in assessing freshwater fishes, as Dr. Tagliacollo will describe in a few in the upcoming presentation. By combining area of occurrence, extent of occurrence, and area of occupancy, and at least two of the following conditions, whether the ranges are fragmented, and also changes in the number of locations or fluctuations in the number of locations can affect the decision on how to assign these as critically endangered or other threat categories. So to summarize how the IUCN system works, these are to date the highest quality conservation assessments we have. They use multiple and rigorous criteria. Of course, this requires substantial time and data. And as a result, many, many species, the vast majority, are currently classified as data deficient. And in the face of rapid deforestation and habitat destruction in the Amazon, the conservation community is challenged to develop expedited methods for risk assessment. And that will be the focus of this symposium, using geographic range data exclusively to get a first pass estimate of conservation status while we wait for other data on population trends and habitat quality to come in. The reason for this is the urgency of the habitat and environmental deterioration in the Amazon today. As of 2019, more than 17% of the original pre-Columbian forest cover had already been removed. It's accelerating in last several years. Just in the last 24 months, that should read July 2022. Over 13,000 square kilometers of the Amazon has been deforested, mostly in the south and in the east. As the agricultural frontier expands, largely for production of export commodities to the international community, including especially soybean and also timber, cattle, minerals such as bauxite and gold, and petroleum. Only about 10% of Amazon plant and animal species have been formally described. This is, for example, true for species of, it's actually about a third of the species of trees we think are described according to a recent paper by Steege et al. Of the 15,000 species of trees in the Amazon predicted from a modeling study, we have about 5,000 named species. Trees are more well known than other kinds of plants, and especially smaller bodied organisms such as insects, nematodes, soil organisms, things like that. The scientific solutions to the problem are well known. We need to document the species, especially the ecosystem engineers that drive biogeochemical cycles that affect soil and water quality. You need to remember that only formally described species with a Latin name are recognized by anybody, including scientists, and certainly by conservation biologists and everybody else making decisions about landscape use. We need to provide, we meaning the international community, need to provide countries who occupy Amazonian territory the financial and legal resources to support scientific institutions and the local communities who do much of this work on the ground, to monitor, protect, and restore ecosystems in the Amazon, and to train the next generation of Amazonian scientists. None of this scientific work will solve the problem in the absence of economic solutions, which are driving the destruction of the Amazon. We need the international community to reverse the current set of incentives that drive export-driven commodities, especially soybean, that we need to suspend and thoroughly renegotiate the funding for all existing infrastructure projects until they have regional scale planning involved. We have long known the basic facts. We now have the technical and the organizational capacities to stop the destruction of the Amazon. What we need now is political will and leadership to enforce the existing laws, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which are driving destruction of the Amazon, desiccation of forests all over the world, and to stop the destruction and degradation of the Amazon. To fail the Amazon is to fail the biosphere as a whole. And of course, we fail to act at our peril. I'd like to thank discussions with a number of scientists listed here, as well as logistical and financial support from these agencies. And I would be happy to take any questions.
Hello, we have time for one question, or we can keep them for discussions. Does anyone would like to ask a question? All right, so let's proceed for the next presenter. So I'd like to welcome to the stage Professor Mónica Moraes. She is a professor at the Universidad Mayor de San Andrés in Bolivia. Thank you for being here.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hello, everyone. The SPA team was wondering always when to meet each other, and still.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. Hello, everyone.
But this time, well, we have more or less a virtual meeting, like always. Well, I will show you the example for plants of the Amazon. I think as we have shortened the list of authors is to show an example of how it works, having this preliminary assessment. The Amazon has been described to have 50,000 plant species in the whole region, but only less than 20% has been assessed about its conservation status. You know, the deforestation and climate changes are driving these threatened, and by 2050, it has been estimated that close to half of the all Amazonian plant species are going to be threatened. And this is going to happen first in the southern and eastern side of the Amazon. We also came up to have these numbers for endemic species of plants in Ecuador, Peru, and Brazil for the CBD report we have published last year. And 60% of 65% of around 9,000 species of plants are considered to be endangered. But in some way, the situation or the environment we have are in favor to have these efforts going on. I mean, to consider the impact of the IUCN and Red List in guiding conservation, like the knowledge that is going on, the thing that every action that is required for taxonomic groups and regions and actions are also part of many research teams. Perhaps the fundraising efforts have to prioritize the focus on these groups of threatened species, but as at least the national policies and legislations have been created protected areas, for example, and as we know, it's not really a warrant, but at least something is going on in the region. So if we consider this preliminary assessment protocol as a protocol, we started having a checklist last year, and we divided the whole list between trees and non-trees species. And we have downloaded the occurrence of neotropical plants from the GBIF. And we started in April this year to work very hard on this list and cleaning the taxonomy as well as the geographic coordinates by this package of plant art developed by Renato Lima, who is a co-author of this contribution. And afterwards, we have had this preliminary assessment of multi-species conservation status, which is using the same as IUCN is using, the CONAR package, and basing only on the extent of occurrences, as James has pointed out before. And this has been applied for the whole region of the Amazon basin, and also including the protected areas. In other words, and a little bit specific, the first part of this long and species by species assessment, from one side is the source of information for local red list. But also there is a need of assessments of other aspects such as threats, uses, research, and others. So we considered this is a suggestion of a possible threat status. And in our case, it was based only on the extent of occurrence that is also included in the IUCN criteria. And we have focused more on the overall basing level than, and considering also individual species. So we started having 3 million records at the beginning of those vascular plants in the neotropics, and it was shortened to 1.3 million for the Amazon. And in total, we gathered this information for 20 families. But we know that we have reviewed only the 45% of this recorded flora. And between 1% to 32 has more than 200 records for non-trees and trees, respectively. And this, the results show that these potentially threatened plants in the Amazon consider only 2 categories, which are endangered and vulnerable. We have not included the CR, the critically endangered category. Therefore, we have around 850 trees and 438 non-trees identified as potentially threatened. And we know also that some of those species agree with the categories that have been applied by the IUCN. But a very large number, that means close to 60%, have been classified as low concern, non-threatened, or deficient data. We also could have in the whole region a distinction between tree species and non-tree species, but including the concentration of number of species by the region, and also finding these spaces that we considered as spatial gaps in biological data. That means that we also have to give a lesson from this. We have to learn that they are a priority to search in those areas where we don't have data or information at all. So if we consider the extent of occurrence versus these threatened category and life forms, first, non-species were categorized as critically endangered. Also, between non-tree and trees species, the outliers are slightly more or less the same. But you see that, well, the majority of those species are exceeding 100,000 square kilometers for these extents of occurrence. It's not working. Okay. And if we gather also the counterpart of what IUCN has done by now, if we clean the total number of species, around 600 and 200 species for the Amazon region, still we have 65% that were not evaluated by now. So considering 3 examples, we can show you that agree, all of them, with the category of the IUCN. But looking at the extent of occurrence, we also can see the pattern of distribution. This species, Atalia phalerata, belongs to the palm family, has been assessed as a low concern or not threatened, but you can see that it has a very widespread pattern in the region of the Amazon. Gustavia coriacea, which is a part of the Lesithidaceae family, has been also considered assessed as vulnerable, but has a very restricted distribution in the north of the Amazon. And finally, among the Annonaceae, the Crematosperma bullatum has been assessed as endangered species, although it has a very spot pattern in its distribution. Still, we can work on a very nice polygon for 8 number of records. And also, I can show you here that the species occurrence, well, we are considering, for example, vulnerable in yellow spots, the endangered one in red, and also crossing all these records with the protected areas among tree and non-tree species. Then you find that among tree species, more endangered are being found in the whole basin. Okay, but if we consider the percentage of threatened between those habits per family, then you can find this list that shows the total number of threatened species and the percentage of each family for both types of habits. Then the families with the highest number of threatened species, but it is considering the total for the habit. For example, for tree species, we consider the total of 844, and for orchids, 438. Then you see that, well, orchids and Fabaceae, they are showing the largest, the highest number of threatened species. So if we can refer to the final remarks, for the first place, we can consider this as a preliminary threatened trees and non-tree species. And we have added circa to 1,000 species when we started to do this assessment in April this year that were not in the IUCN red list. 70% are included in protected areas, which can be a good thing, but we know also that it's not really a big warrant. Plant assessments requires more records. That's also a trend. But for our case, we need more than 5 records to minimize the uncertainty. So we know also that the validation process of specimens represents an enormous job for cleaning all these synonyms and recent updates or valid names. But you know, if we are facing this deterioration of the Amazon, it is needed a new tool to complement the IUCN criteria. It's time. So we consider that these tools have been applied using a very short time and detect those data gaps. Well, we are used to work with imperfect data, but we are always willing to conserve these plants as a total. But even that, there are good opportunities to preserve large parts of the Amazon ecosystems. So always it is the same recommendation that everyone has to commit to have better decisions taken in this huge region. Thank you.
or we will need to keep questions for the discussions. I just received the from our ATBC team here. So the next presentation is going to be Professor Vitor Tagliacollo. He's a professor at the Federal University of Uberlândia in Brazil, and he will be presenting about the conservation status of potentially threatened Amazonian fishes. He's going to join us online and will be available for questions after his presentation. Could you start, please?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to present today my work on the conservation status of potentially threatened Amazonian fish species. The Neotropical region extends from the central Mexican plateau around 30° north to the southern Argentinian, and it is home to the greatest concentration of freshwater fish biodiversity on Earth. So far, the ichthyologists have described nearly 6,300 species. Just to put in context, 2 in 5 of all obligate freshwater fish inhabit the neotropics. That means that 40% of all freshwater fishes are in the neotropic. The neotropical freshwater fauna is still very much in a pioneering stage of discovery, with dozens of new species being described each year. The current pace of discovery indicates that the actual fish diversity in the area exceeds 9,000 species, meaning that much as 1/3 of the species in the wild have yet to be described. Most of the neotropic freshwater fishes are members of just 5 major clades or taxonomic ranks. Together, these 5 clades accounts for 87% of all neotropic freshwater species and 96% of the Amazonian fish species. What is known is that the center of diversity for the freshwater ichthyofauna in the neotropics is the lowland, the Amazonian lowland. But the higher endemism is located at the upland areas. Also, lowland rivers, rivers below 250 meters, often exhibit a remarkably high local species richness. And what it's interesting that this whole biota originated tens of millions of years before the geological formation of the modern Amazon and Orinoco River basin. And fishes and amphibians are among the most threatened of all vertebrates, and their species richness are declining rapidly at regional and continental scale. Or wild, an average of 30% of freshwater fishes are classified under threat categories by the IUCN Red List. And what is important to say that the neotropical fishes are increasingly threatened by many human activities. The most immediate and widespread impact comes from the habitat degradation, especially due to the deforestation and other land use changes from expanding agriculture frontiers and from the constructions of dams and other water diversions and structures. And to classify species in threat categories, the IUCN provides a guideline for species conservation planning. The species are, the conservation status are assigned, assessed against 5 criteria. They are based on geographic range, population size, and population decline or increasing. In the neotropics, 2 countries, Brazil and Colombia, and a few other local studies in other Latin American countries, have this red lists with information of threatened species that followed the IUCN guidelines and protocols. So what is known about the conservation status of the neotropical fishes? So we know so far that hundreds of fish species with small adult body sizes and restricted geographic ranges are already known to be threatened with extinction. Nearly 50% of all fish species in the Neotropics are still waiting the IUCN assessment, and also that many Latin America countries do not have reliable information on this potentially threatened species. So we have two main goals. The first is to investigate if geographic and taxonomic data can be used to rapidly assess potential conservation threats from the Amazonian fish species. And second, we want to generate a preliminary extinction risk assessment for the Amazonian species that is still waiting for the IUCN assessment. As a first step, we compiled a list of the Amazonian fishes from a Schmeier catalog of fishes, including 2,720 species. And then we divide this list into subgroups. One, including only species that have already the IUCN conservation assessment, and another list including those species still waiting for the IUCN assessment. Next, we compiled a list of the Amazon species and their respective extinction risks using the red lists from Brazil and Colombia, both that use this guidelines from the IUCN. So besides the taxonomic database, we also compiled a spatial database including geographic information of preserved specimen that we obtained from the taxonomic literature and museum collections, and also from metadata repositories like GB, Fishbase, and SpeciesLink. As a second step, we applied an automated cleaning pipeline to remove duplicates and geographic coordinates with potential errors, and also validate each one of the species distribution by plotting maps of individual species and comparing them with those published in the literature. After these steps, we obtain a database with including over 55,000 unique coordinates from about 2,200 species, representing 81% of the entire Amazonian ichthyofauna. With this database, for each species, we measured the extent of occurrence, OEOO, and also gathered species topographic elevation ranges. And once again, we divide this list into groups, one including the IUCN species with IUCN red list extinction risk assessment and those without the IUCN assessments. And to achieve our second goal, we use the R package CONAR to provide a preliminary conservation assessment for 757 Amazonian species, fish species, for which extinction risks have not been yet assigned by the IUCN red list. We use the CONAR package to classify species only assuming the criterion B, the geographic ranges, and our preliminary conservation assessment classified species into non-threat and then the three other threatened categories, critically endangered, endangered, and vulnerable. As a result of this process, we identified that 7.8% of the Amazonian species are classified in one of the threat category defined by the IUCN, and the group with the highest number of threatened species is the cyprinodontiforms, the killifish. We also realized that extinction risks is greater in species with smaller geographic ranges, which inhabit upland rivers and which are recently and more recently described. Plotting the distributions, it's clear to see that higher extinction risks are in the species that are located outside protected areas, particularly in headwaters, in uplands, upland headwaters in the Tocantins Araguaia. And to achieve our second goal, we use geographic and taxonomic data alone to generate a preliminary conservation assessment for 757 species. They are still waiting for the IUCN assessment and identified 311 species that can be potentially threatened. This number represents 41% of all species that are still waiting for IUCN conservation assessment. So we can expand the number of potentially threatened Amazon species from 129, there are today in the red lists, to 440 species as potentially or threatened or potentially threatened. So that means that nearly 16% of all Amazonian fishes might be threatened with extinction. Looking at the taxonomic orders, once again, the Cyprinodont forms is the group with the highest number of potentially threatened species. And plotting the map, we see similar patterns. The potentially threatened species are often located outside protected areas and also in upland river system, often in the headwaters. The Xingu Araguaia, once again, seems to be area with a higher number of potentially threatened species, but also the Xingu Tapajós and the uplands of the Andean Cordillera in Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. In conclusion, this study verifies that often threatened Amazon species were recently described, are range restricted, and are more frequently confined to upland areas of the Tocantins-Araguaia River Basin. Using CONAR, we predicted that about 311 species awaiting extinction risk assessment are potentially threatened. These potentially threatened Amazonian species are commonly located outside protected areas in the upland headwaters of the Tocantins Araguaia, Xingu, and Tapajós river basins, and also the Andean Cordillera in Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. The results expand the number of threat Amazon species from 129 to 440 threatened or potentially threatened species, representing about 16% of all Amazon fishes. The conservation efforts direct toward neotropical aquatic biodiversity must prioritize habitats in uplands, particularly in the headwaters located in the Brazilian Shield and the Andean Cordillera. And the conservation status of many freshwater fishes will benefit by prioritizing geographic areas with the largest number of coexisting and threatened species. One of the examples could be the Tocantins-Araguaia River Basin. Thank you for your attention, and I'll be glad to answer your questions.
Thank you, Victor, for your presentation. Does anyone would like to ask any questions? Victor is online, available. No? Do we have any online questions? Are there any online ones? No? Okay. All right. It's being answered already online. So we're going to proceed with our next speaker, Dr. Camila Ribas. She's a researcher from the National Institute of Amazonian Research, INPA, in Brazil. Camila's presentation will be focused on the conservation status of Amazonian birds. She's going to join us online as well. So I think the presentation can start, please.
we have a technical issue. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to make my presentation first. Sorry? We need a break because of the time. So we need to have a break for 15 minutes following the program, and when I'm going to make my presentation. And then we can include Camila's presentation during the discussion time, if that's all right. Okay, yes. Okay, thank you. So we're going to be back in about 30 minutes. Sorry about that.
Hello, my name is Camila.
Hello, everyone. Let's start again. So I am the next presentation. So I'll introduce myself. My name is Felipe França. I am a lecturer in the University of Bristol in the UK. For me, it's a pleasure to be here to talk about our research. I'd like to thank Julia and James for the invitation to participate in this symposium. My presentation is focused on the Synergize project that started 2.5 years ago. And the idea is to show how we can use this network to inform conservation strategies, as well to understand the knowledge gaps regarding the biodiversity, the insect biodiversity in the Amazon. So our global knowledge of biodiversity is limited by practical and fundamental limitations. Just to give an idea, researchers and practitioners actually work with incomplete and unrepresentative data. But what does that mean? So if you look in those figures, you can see, for example, that most of the information we have are from outside the tropics for vertebrate populations and for insect, for temporal data sets in these figures. The second key point here in terms of our bias in the knowledge of biodiversity regards to the fact that we have a focus on some organisms rather than others. So if we compare here the amount of data we have for vertebrates and for insects, we can see that we have much more on this case. And these bias, they affect the way we can understand conservation, we can inform conservation. So just to give you an idea, around 1%, only around 1% of all known insect species have had their conservation status assessed by the UCN by 2022. So the literature also highlights some shortfalls or knowledge gaps regarding biodiversity knowledge. So I'm going to focus here today on 3 of them. The first one is the linear shortfall. It's related to the difference between the number of species we know and the number of species we don't know. The second one is the Prestonian shortfall. This is related to the lack of data on abundance and population dynamics for most species across time and space. And the third one is related to the Wallacean shortfall, which refers to the limited knowledge we have on the geographical distribution of most species. So building on those knowledge gaps, my goals here, and I structured my presentation into 3 main goals. First, I would like to introduce the Synergize network and database with a particular focus on insects. Then I'm going to bring some results from this database as a way to show the magnitude of those 3 shortfalls regarding the knowledge of Amazonian insect biodiversity. And then I'm going to exemplify how we can integrate this database to other large-scale data sets to inform conservation assessments in the Amazon. So here, just to give you an idea of the project, the Synergize stands for Synthesizing Ecological Response to Degradation in Amazonian Environments. This is part of the Brazilian Synthesis Research Center. This is the first Latin America Center for Research Synthesis. We started in 2020 with 25 collaborators, and through the collaboration with their networks and their data sets, we had around 4,004 sites, including data from flora and fauna, not both at all of them, some for some groups, as you can see here. And we had around 600 freshwater sites. So this table here shows the distribution of sites across our groups. 2 key points here. First, the project is focused on the Brazilian Amazon initially. Second, those data sets are community level data. That means that for each of those sites, we have multiple species abundance. As this comes from different sources in the literature and also on published literature, this means that we have some difference in terms of methods through which the data was collected. But this gives you a summary of what we had when we started. And then 2.5 years later, through the contact and a Herculean effort of a team of postdocs and researchers, we now have around 390 collaborators from 250 institutions. This map here shows the distribution of those data sets, 8,600 for sites and almost 4,000 freshwater sites. So you can see here, for most groups, we more than doubled the amount of sites. And over the last 2 years, we have been working a lot to standardize those data sets, to validate the species, to validate geographical coordinates, to integrate them and make those data sets be able to communicate. So now I'm going to bring some results from our insect database. Something that I didn't mention here is that the rest of the presentation is going to be focused on these 3 groups and the final part on dung beetles. So regarding the Linnean shortfall, so if we look into our data sets, this graph here shows the number of records. We have around 430,000 records for dung beetles. 52% of those records are assigned to unknown species or morph species, and around 48 of them are species we know, valid species. If we look into the list of species we have, around 1,300, 83% of them are morph species or unknown, and 17% are known. Results are a bit different if we look in the ant communities. So 47% of the records we have is for unknown species, 53% for known. But when we look into these 4,000 morph species, about 85% of those taxonomic assignments, if we can call that, are unknown species. And for the aquatic insects, when pulling them all together, we have around 58,000 records, 700, let's call it morpho and species, and 43% of these records are unknown. 35% of this list is unknown. So this is a way to quantify how much we don't know based on ecological studies from the Amazon. Regarding the Prestonian shortfall, on the lack of knowledge of abundance data across time. This figure is based on our metadata, number of sites we have. So here you can see that for freshwater Heteroptera, we have almost 1,500. We have around 1,300 for terrestrial dung beetles and ants, less than 400 for Odonata and macroinvertebrates. So thinking about those data sets across time, so when pulling them all together, we have abundance data for those groups since 1917 from 2020. But this is pulling all them together. So that means that for some groups, we have data only from 2010, for example. And thinking on how can we understand the distribution of those species, this map shows for the Brazilian Amazon, the distribution of sites, freshwater sites and terrestrial or forest sites where we have this data from. And finally, for this part of the shortfalls, I very cherry-picked here. I chose my favorite dung beetle species and one of the most abundant in the area I work to show that we can also understand a little bit of the distribution, the geographical distribution of the species that are within our database. Not all of them will have this amount of data, but this is just to give you a glimpse, like an idea of the potential of this data. The final part of my presentation is more aligned with the proposal of this symposium. And for doing that, we combined the information from Synergize and Geber-Filho. And what did we do? We did an exercise to try to guess, to understand the conservation status of Amazonian insects. And here I'm going to focus on dung beetles. So we combined the data set we have from the Amazon, the Brazilian Amazon, and the data sets from Geber-Filho from North and South America for dung beetles. Then after working on R with many functions for cleaning this data, validating it, validating geographical coordinates, and filtering it for the Amazon countries, we had this amount of data here. And then to ensure we are doing things correctly, we collaborated with Fernando Vaz-de-Mello. He now is the curator of the larger dung beetle entomological collection in Latin America. And all together with those data sets combined, we had around 229,000 records of dung beetles from 650 species. And then we use this massive data set in the package CONAR and Red List R to carry out multi-species conservation status assessments. So if you were here for the presentation of James, we are using the criteria B, the same that our colleagues also presented for plants and fish and for birds in the next presentation. We use the extent of occurrence, overlapping it with the occurrence in protected areas. So this gives an idea of how much of the area of occurrence overlaps with protected areas in the Amazon. So what did we find? First, the Red List currently assessed 231 species of dung beetles in the South America. In the Amazon, for the species we assessed, there are around 100 of them. So our exercise for 650 species found that around 17% or 110 of them would be considered as at critical risk.
200 species were assigned as endangered, 87 as vulnerable, and 250 as of least concern or near threatened. We didn't have any data deficient one because we followed the same protocols from the other presentations, and each species needed to have at least 5 sites. So because all of them had at least 5 sites, we don't have anyone assigned as data deficient. And to give you an idea of what we found, I selected 2 species, again, Coprophonus lancefer, one of the biggest species we have in the region I work. This main figure here shows the combination of all data sets. And in gray, you can see the protected areas. So you can see that there is a lot of overlap between the EEO, or the extent of occurrence, with those areas. And here on the right, you can, on my left, your right, you can see the contribution of each of those data sets we worked on. So you see that here we have Synergize, we have Geber-Filho, and we have the Dengue beetle collection from Cuiabá. This is a species that hasn't been assessed before in the UCN. And based on our exercise, we assigned it at likely to be of least concern or near threatened. Our second species, Bdelirius paraensis, is a species that we have less data, but we were still able to build a polygon for it. So here is the source of data. We didn't have any data in Geber-Filho. And the overall idea is to show, for example, this species that has been considered as data deficient would be considered as vulnerable based on our exercise. And the final slide for this part of the presentation before going to the conclusions is another key potential for this data set. This is fresh off the oven. I finished that yesterday. And there are 2 key messages that I would like to highlight from this. First, that we can use those large data sets. Integrating those biodiverse data sets can help us to understand the patterns of species richness density in the Amazon. So we can think about conservation strategies that are focused on those areas, as you can see here. And this is the number of threatened species based on our exercise. So we can see that those areas, they overlap. And then the second key message from these 2 maps here is that we not only are able to assess where we have higher densities of species, but you can see that there are different regions here where we have no data on dengue beetle diversity. So this highlights the importance of investing on research and expeditions and taxonomy work for addressing that. And in terms of concluding remarks, I would like to highlight some challenges and opportunities when doing this work. So first, recognizing that the Synergize insect database results from a collaborative effort of over 90 researchers. That's why I had so many co-authors in the abstract, because one of our policies is to recognize those that did the great effort in the field collecting that data. And also, we are currently working with Kipotech, is a startup in Brazil. They are building, in collaboration with us, a database for receiving the data from insects, terrestrial insects, and birds. So watch this space. We're expecting to launch it by the next semester this year. The second point regards to the fact that for the Amazonian entomofauna, there is so much we don't know. And this is really this strikes me as something really important, because a recent work has shown that around 12% of the Amazon have been deforested without being collected a single specimen of tree. If we don't know about trees, imagine about insects. So this is something that worries me. So we need investment on research for that. And finally, I would like to end my presentation highlighting that quantifying biodiversity knowledge shortfalls is key to inform future research efforts and conservation strategies. Our exercise for 650 dengue beetle species is a way to provide, how can I say, evidence that using large biodiverse data sets can help us to improve our understanding of conservation in the Amazon. So that's it. Thank you very much for your time. I would like to thank the Synergizers, a team of researchers that have been working intensely, as well as the funders and the scientific panel for the Amazon that supported me to be here today. Thank you. Happy to have any questions in person or online. No, okay. So I'm going to proceed for the next presentation. Camila Ribas,
She is Dr. Camila Ribas. She is a researcher at the National Institute of Amazonian Research, INPA, in Brazil. And she's going to be presenting about the conservation status of birds in the Amazon. We had an issue. She was supposed to present before my presentation, but now we're going to use the discussion time for that.
Ribas, and I'm going to be talking to you today about evaluating conservation status of Amazonian birds. This work is mostly the result of the PhD thesis of Marco Rego, who is a student at the Louisiana State University Museum of Natural Science. The co-authors here belong to the Louisiana State University and to INPA, the National Institute for Research in Amazonia. I'm also part of the science panel for the Amazon. When we talk about Amazonia, we have to remember that Amazonian ecosystems are very diverse. Amazonia is actually an assemblage of different ecosystems that coexist in the same large area. In Amazonia, we have seasonally flooded environments which are associated to the riverine cycles, called in Brazil Vaz-de-Mello. We also have non-flooded forests called terra firme, which are never flooded by the rivers. And also we have open vegetation formations, including white sand, campinas and campinaranas, and savannas. This habitat heterogeneity is reflected in the patterns of distribution and endemism of Amazonian birds. Many birds are habitat specialists, so that areas of endemism that have been described for birds associated to flooded environments are quite different from areas of endemism that have been described for birds from non-flooded environments. So here in the bottom left, we have areas of endemism for birds associated to flooded forests, and on the right here, we have the classic areas of endemism associated that have been described for birds, which are specialized on non-flooded habitats. On top of these distinct habitat associations, we also have a large heterogeneity of environments in Amazonia. Like here, this classification that was recently published by Renato in 2019, classifying Amazonia into 8 distinct geoecological classes. On top of all this heterogeneity, we have diverse impacts that threaten Amazonia today. So deforestation for agriculture and cattle, and also the building of dams or waterways, they impact Amazonia in different ways. Here in this map, we can see the different interfluvia that are the areas of endemism for upland forest birds in these different colors. Then we can see deforestation until 2018, plotted in red, showing that deforestation greatly affects southeastern interfluvia in Amazonia, much more than it affects the rest of Amazonia, for example. Also, the lozangos and dots show existing and planned dams, and these dams are also not evenly distributed, and the impact of the dams is especially strong on seasonally flooded environments and the species associated to these environments. So the impacts are not evenly distributed in the space and are not evenly distributed in the different habitats that exist in Amazonia. So this is a first glimpse of Marco's dataset. This is the dataset that he built, includes more than 620,000 records of Amazonian birds, more than 10,000 localities. When we look at how these records are distributed in the space, it's clear that it's not even. So some regions in red here have many specimens in these localities, while many areas of endemism, all these blue here and the gray and white, are regions that are undersampled. So there are few specimens described for these areas. Another important sampling bias is that most records are close to roads and rivers in Amazonia. So many more records than expected by chance are located close to roads and rivers, showing that sampling this spatial bias is also important. In addition, there are several areas of Amazonia that have very few records in collections, like here the blue areas, and are greatly affected by deforestation. So many places in Amazonia are suffering from high deforestation and are actually very little known for their avifauna. So another important thing to consider when talking about this data set is the taxonomic bias. So in taxonomy of birds includes many subspecies. And so we also wanted to know how this influences the patterns that we see in the data. For this data set that we assembled, when we include only currently recognized species, we have 2043 species in the data set. But if we consider all described taxa, including species and subspecies, we reach almost 4,000 taxa in this data set. For richness, you can see that the pattern of richness doesn't change that much in the two data sets. And this probably happens because many subspecies are allopatric. So the richness pattern doesn't change so much. If we do a subspecies per species ratio in richness for Amazonia, we can see that the largest differences between these two data sets lies along the main rivers, which are the suture zones between the large Amazonian interfluvia. However, when we look at composition, we can see that there is a lot more difference between the two data sets. So when we plot changes in composition of communities, we see that the changes are different, the characteristics of the communities are different when we consider species and when we consider species plus subspecies, so that composition patterns are more affected by the taxonomic treatment. So here, now looking at the threat status for these birds, we are going to be looking now to the data set that includes species plus subspecies, so 4,000 taxa, more or less. And we are going to be talking about the range, mostly about range size criterion of IUCN. So in this map here on the left shows the number of threatened taxa in different parts of Amazonia without considering deforestation. We can see that in this scenario, threatened taxa are concentrated in southeastern Amazonia, in northern Amazonia, and in the Andes. When we include deforestation in the analysis, we see that the number of threatened taxa increases a lot, mostly in southeastern Amazonia and also here in the north, right? So again, this is the data set with deforestation with 4,000 taxa, including species and subspecies. This is the map that I just showed you, showing current climate and deforestation, the distribution of threatened taxa here. And when we include, we combine the future impact of climate change, we can see that this number of threatened taxa increases a lot in the mild climate change scenario and much more in the extreme climate change scenario, with the impact always being concentrated in southeastern Amazonia, showing that southeastern Amazonian interfluvia are really of concern when talking about bird conservation. Looking at the number of threatened taxa in these different scenarios, we can see that in the model of current climate with deforestation, we would have 158 endangered taxa and 385 vulnerable taxa, in a total of 543 threatened taxa in Amazonia, in Amazonian birds. Currently threatened Amazonian birds, according to IUCN, is 165. This already shows how considering a more detailed taxonomy that recognizes subspecies as taxa of interest for conservation makes a large difference in the number of taxa that are considered threatened. So current taxonomy largely overestimates the ranges and underestimates the threat status of Amazonian birds. When we combine the impact of climate change, we see that, again, many more taxa are considered threatened in mild climate change scenario, and a large portion of Amazonian taxa is threatened in extreme climate change scenarios. We can also look at the percentage of the extent of occurrence of these taxa that is protected. When we do that, we can see that taxa that have smaller portions of their ranges protected are concentrated in southeastern Amazonia with about 30% of their ranges protected. So this again shows that there is a great concern about these taxa that occur in this region that is under threat. In this analysis, we wanted to look at the importance of protected areas in Amazonia for conserving these Amazonian birds that we studied. So in this graph, we show the number of taxa which have distinct portions of their ranges within protected areas. In red, we are showing only protected areas. In green, we are showing protected areas and indigenous territories. So it's evident that indigenous territories increase the portion of protected ranges for Amazonian birds, making a large difference in the amount of protection that each one of these taxa that we studied here have protected. So finally, in this analysis, we identify priority areas for creation or expansion of protected areas and indigenous lands. This analysis was made using current distribution of indigenous territories and of the subspecies that we studied. We also considered deforestation, current deforestation, and the portion of ranges of these subspecies that is already protected. So considering all these things, we came up with these regions of higher priority for creating or expanding protected areas and indigenous territories. And another very important concern is maintaining conservation status of current protected areas and indigenous territories that are especially under threat in recent times, because they are very important for preserving Amazonian birds. Thank you very much. These are all our funding agencies that have supported our work. Thank you.
And Camila is online if you have any questions. All right, so I would like to thank you all for being here with us, participating in this symposium. Also, thank you everyone that supported us through the ATBC for this opportunity. Thank you. Have a good day.
Slipping from my hands, sands a time of its own. Take your seaside arms, right for the next line. I want the truth to be known. I know this much is true. Bought a ticket to the world. Now I've come back again. Why to find it hard, write the next line? I want the truth to be said. I know this much is true.
train.